Well, I am very grateful to be here in Rome. I am sorry that I'm not addressing you in Italian. Non parlo italiano. But I wanted to talk a little bit about the book of Abraham. Actually, Bishop Perego asked me to talk about this topic. As he mentioned, I'm an Egyptologist. I'm here in Italy, attending the International Congress of Egyptologists in Firenze. And so I'm wearing two hats. Today I'm speaking both as an Egyptologist and as a member of the church, and I'm going to talk about the book of Abraham, because for some reason people think that Egyptologists should have something to say about this subject. The book of Abraham says that it is a translation of certain ancient records that fell into our hands from the catacombs of Egypt, which were written by Abraham while he was in Egypt and are called the Book of Abraham, written by his own hand upon papyrus. So it says that these fell into Joseph Smith's hands. So how did they get there? Well, our story starts with two Italians. One of these was Bernardino Drovetti. He was a consul in Egypt at the beginning of the 19th century. And one of the people he had working for him was named Antonio Labolo. And Drovetti acquired artifacts. And Labolo went out and found some of these artifacts and was one of the people that Drovetti employed to find antiquities. And Drovetti sold his antiquities to museums all over Europe. And then he wasn't getting as much money as he wanted to for his antiquities, so he had Labolo choose some to send to America. And these traveled around America and finally ended up in the hands of Joseph Smith. And they were traveling nearby, and Joseph Smith and other members of the church bought them. So these papyri were acquired by Joseph Smith in 1835, and he had either 4 or 5 papyri, and we designate these by the people who owned them in ancient times. And now we have only fragments of 2 of these papyri. And that's what they look like. We know that 4 of these papyri come from the time of the Ptolemies in Egypt, and most likely date to the 2nd century BC. And you can find pieces of Drovetti's collection in many places around Europe, including Leipzig, Paris, Leiden, London, Oxford, Torino, Vienna, Tübingen, and many other places. When Joseph Smith got the papyri, they were damaged. And he took some of these papyri that were damaged and mounted them in frames, or put them on paper, put them under glass, put them in frames, so they could be hung on the wall, although I don't know that they ever actually did that. And these were mounted in 1837. But they still had other rolls that were complete rolls of papyri. We have the following descriptions of these papyri that come from Joseph Smith's time. They are described as a number of glazed slides like picture frames containing sheets of papyrus with Egyptian inscriptions and hieroglyphs. Another long roll of manuscript from which the Book of Abraham was translated. Another roll, and 2 or 3 other small pieces of papyrus with astronomical calculations, epitaphs, etc. The papyrus fragments that we now have were these number of glazed slides like picture frames. The long roll of manuscript from which the Book of Abraham was translated is now missing. The remaining fragments that we do have are a Book of the Dead and something called the Book of Breathings, and not the Book of Abraham. But according to the historical documents, we shouldn't expect them to be the Book of Abraham, because they don't come from the long roll. So if they were the Book of Abraham, we would be very surprised. Because we don't have the papyri that the Book of Abraham was on, we can't check the translation with the manuscript. But we can compare the Book of Abraham with the world of Abraham. And that's what I'm going to talk about the rest of this time. biblical scholars cannot agree on when to date Abraham. They say sometime between 2200 and 1600 before Christ. And some of them don't believe Abraham ever lived. But in this case, the book of Abraham helps us to decide when Abraham lived. The book of Abraham describes how Abraham lived in the land of the Chaldees, but because of difficulties, he had to leave that place. And we now know that Egyptians were in the land of the Chaldees only 3 times in ancient history. Between the reigns of Sesostris III and Amenemhat III, between the reigns of Tutmosis II and Amenhotep IV, and during the reign of Ptolemy III. And only one of these times could be the time when Abraham lived, and that is between the reigns of Sesostris III and Amenemhat III, about 1860 to 1800 BC. A new autobiographical text that was found about 10 years ago describes an Egyptian expedition to Byblos under either Sesostris II or Sesostris III. When the Egyptians came to Byblos, they found that Byblos was having a war with the town of Ulaza. And then our biography has a hole. And the next thing we know, the Egyptians are in charge of both Byblos and Ulaza. And for the next 2 generations, the rulers of Byblos listed themselves not as kings, but as Egyptian officials. And so from this time period, we also find sphinxes of Amenemhat III at Aleppo and at Ugarit, which is on the seacoast. And you notice that they're all hacked up. When the Egyptians left, apparently they weren't liked. Italian archaeologists have also found signs of Egyptian gods at Ebla, up in northern Syria. Okay, so where exactly was the land of the Chaldeans? Most biblical scholars think that the land of the Chaldean is in southern Iraq, because in the 7th and 6th centuries before Christ, the Chaldeans lived there. But in earlier times, they lived in many other places, including in the north. For example, in the 9th century BC, the Chaldeans lived north in Syria. it seems that sometime during the 8th century BC, so almost 800 years after Abraham, the Chaldeans moved from northern Syria down to southern Iraq. According to the book of Abraham, the Egyptians ruled over the land of the Chaldeans, which means that it must have been on the west side of the Euphrates, because the Egyptians never got to the east side of the Euphrates until the reign of Ptolemy III. In the 3rd century BC. So we need to look for the land of Chaldeans in northwest Syria or in southeast Turkey. The book of Abraham mentions that Abraham was offered up on an altar that stood by the hill that was called Potiphar's Hill on the head of the plains of Olishem. Some scholars have suggested that this Olishem is identical with a place called Ulishum, and that is mentioned in very old inscriptions. And from these inscriptions, we know that Olishem lay somewhere in the neighborhood of Ebla. 2 years ago, some Turkish archaeologists suggested that Olishem or Ulishum was located at the site of Ulam Huyuk, and so far this is the best guess for Olishem, but it's only a guess. During the time of Abraham, Ulam Huyuk was the major metropolitan city in the plains of Kilis. And so Ur of the Chaldees should be somewhere in the neighborhood. So Abraham said, "In the land of the Chaldeans, in the residence of my fathers, I, Abraham, saw that it was necessary for me to find another place of residence. So he left Ur of the Chaldees for Haran," here, and which was on the other side of the Euphrates River. And after the death of Amenemhat III, when the Egyptian empire in the area collapsed, he could go back to Canaan because the Egyptians weren't there anymore. Abraham's autobiography starts very similar to the only other autobiography that we have from Syria from the Middle Bronze period. This other autobiography belongs to Idrimi, the ruler of Alalach. Idrimi's autobiography begins, "In the city of Aleppo, in the residence of my father, I, Idrimi, son of Ilamilamah, servant of Hadad, Hebat, and Ishtar, my mistress, the lady of Allah, suffered a problem, so that I needed to leave the people, or to go to the people of the city of Amar, my mother's family, and flee there. The two autobiographies have many such similarities. They both emphasize that they traveled to their new residences because of divine revelation. They mention the promises to their forefathers. Such as Abraham does at the end of the first chapter. Now, Abraham said that when he lived in Ur of the Chaldees, the Egyptians sought to offer him up. My fathers, having turned from their righteousness, and from the holy commandments which the Lord their God had given unto them, unto the worshipping of the gods of the heathen, utterly refused to hearken to my voice. For their hearts were set to do evil, and were wholly turned to the god of Elkanah, and the god of Libnah, and the god of Mamacrah, and the god of Koresh, and the god of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. So they were worshiping pagan gods, and he says that they'd turned their hearts to the sacrifice of the heathen in offering up their children unto these dumb idols, and hearken not to my voice. That's important. They hearkened not to his voice. He had been talking against them, but endeavored to take away my life by the hand of the priest of Elkanah. And the priest of Elkanah was also the priest of Pharaoh. Now, human sacrifice is attested throughout Egyptian history, especially during the Middle Kingdom, which is Abraham's time. This is an example of a boundary stela from the Middle Kingdom that was set up by the Pharaoh Ugaf in Byblos. And it says that everyone that is found between these boundary stones, except a priest about his duties, should be burnt. The archaeological context of the inscription shows that the boundary stones were part of a processional way in between the temple and the cemetery. And they would have a parade there every so often. That human sacrifices, including burnings, actually took place is shown by a historical inscription of Sesostris I, who explains that he went down to a place called Toad, and that he found that the priests were rebelling against his strictures, and so he had them impaled, flayed, decapitated, and burnt. And so we know that this actually took place historically. Abraham is not necessarily an exception. And lastly, we have archaeological evidence for human sacrifice. At a Middle Kingdom fortress at Murgissa, which was part of the Egyptian Empire at that time, they found a decapitated body of a man, along with ritual implements, flint knives, melted wax, and broken pottery like this. And nearly all scholars have taken this as an example of human sacrifice. This particular broken pottery actually has an execration text of the Middle Kingdom. It says who this should be done to, and that includes everyone who speaks evil, who talks evil, who curses evil, who plans evil, and so forth. Which is, so if you spoke evil of the Pharaoh or of his religion, you could expect to be offered. And so we have, Abraham says that's what he was doing, and sure enough, that's what they tried to do to him. This is a papyrus that tells us about how they would do this human sacrifice. It's now in the British Museum. It says that they would take these, well, if you didn't have an evildoer like Abraham, you would have a wax figure, and you would take it and bind it, spit on it 4 times, trample on it under your left foot, stab it with a spear, decapitate it with a knife, throw it in the fire, and spit on it while it's burning. So this Egyptian ritual actually explains to us what was going on there, and explains the peculiar expression in the book of Abraham that these offerings were done after the manner of the Egyptians. We have other examples of human sacrifice in the ancient world, but no one did it after the manner of the Egyptians. No one else. What we find from these sacrifices, and we compare the Egyptian ones to the ones in the book of Abraham, both human sacrifices were rituals. Both were required because of cultic offenses, such as speaking evil of the king or the religion. And they both show that human sacrifices could take place outside of Egypt, but in places under Egyptian control. In the 2nd chapter of the book of Abraham, after he's gone to Haran and is safe, he enters into a covenant with the Lord. 3 years ago, there was a book that examined all of the covenants and treaties from the ancient world. And the scholars who wrote this book said that the form of the covenants changes over time. And so if you have a covenant, you can actually date it by the form that it takes. And so we can look at this and the covenants in the book of Abraham. So first, it starts with a ritual or a ceremony. And this is, and so in the book of Abraham, it says, "But I, Abraham, and my brother's son, prayed unto the Lord, and the Lord appeared unto me and said unto me." Then comes this introduction of the Lord to the covenant, he says, "Arise and take Lot with thee, for I have purposed to take thee away out of Haran, and to make of thee a minister to bear my name in a strange land, which I will give unto thy seed after thee for an everlasting possession, when they hearken to my voice. For I am the Lord thy God. I dwell in heaven, the earth is my footstool. I stretch my hand over the sea, and it obeys my voice. I cause the wind and the fire to be my chariot. I say to the mountains, depart hence, and behold, they are taken away by a whirlwind, in an instant, suddenly. My name is Jehovah, and I know the end from the beginning. Therefore my hand shall be over thee. And I will make of thee a great nation, and I will bless thee above all measure. And make thy name great among all nations, and thou shalt be a blessing unto thy seed after thee, that in their hands they shall bear this ministry and the priesthood unto all nations." So the next part of the covenant has various stipulations that go with the covenant, what the promises are and what the expectations in the covenant are. And these continue. "And I will bless them through thy name, that is, for as many as receive this gospel shall be called after thy name, and shall be accounted thy seed, and shall rise up and bless thee as their father. And I will bless them that bless thee, and curse them that curse thee. And in thee, that is in thy priesthood, and in thy seed, that is thy priesthood, for I give unto thee a promise that this right shall continue in thee, and in thy seed after thee. That is to say, the literal seed, or the seed of the body, shall all the families of the earth be blessed, even with the blessings of the gospel, which are the blessings of salvation, even of life eternal." So this covenant has three parts: a ceremony or rite at the beginning, an introduction, and the stipulations. Normally, at this time, they have a ceremony, an introduction, and stipulations, and maybe an oath or another ceremony. And sometimes they have curses that are attached to when you don't obey the covenant. Later, at, say, Moses' time, they have historical sections, they have witnesses, they have blessings and curses and so forth. And so from the form, we know that the covenant of Abraham comes between sometime during this, comes before the second half of the 2nd century BC. So it's from Abraham's time. Now, after Abraham entered into a covenant with the Lord, he went to the land of Canaan, and while he was in Canaan, there was a great famine. And Abraham decided to go into Egypt because the famine was really severe. Now, in the meantime, the pharaohs that were seeking Abraham's life had died. And Egypt was ruled by a completely different dynasty, the 15th dynasty. And this dynasty wasn't Egyptians. These were foreigners. And so Abraham notes that the pharaohs were a partaker of the blood of the Canaanites by birth. And the 15th dynasty, the pharaohs all have Canaanite names. They are Canaanites. Now, before Abraham went down into Egypt, the Lord showed him a vision. And he said, "Abraham, I'll show you these things before you go down to Egypt. So you can preach all of these words. So the third chapter of Abraham is a vision in preparation to go down into Egypt. And so it was meant for the Egyptians of Abraham's day rather than us, which might explain why most of us can't understand what is going on in the third chapter of Abraham. So let me explain it to you, or my understanding of it. So for the astronomy, the book of Abraham takes as its center point the earth upon which thou standest. And it mentions different heavenly bodies. For example, the stars, among which is Kolob. And this fixed stars, or sphere of the stars, forms as a background under which planets or lights move. And the sun and the moon are counted among these planets. And so we shouldn't think of them as planets the way we think of them in the modern world, because the sun isn't a planet for us. So these lights go around according to their times and seasons in their revolutions, as Abraham says. They're going around something, and that is the earth upon which you stand. So it describes a geocentric astronomy, which almost all astronomies before Copernicus were, including the astronomy of the Egyptians at Abraham's time. And each heavenly body has a revolution that is set with a fixed time. And this fixed time appears to be the time of the revolution of the heavenly body around the earth. The longer the time is associated with a higher orbit around the earth. And it's said that this is in order because it standeth above the earth upon which thou standest. Therefore the reckoning of his time is not so many as to its numbers of days and months and years. The higher the orbit, the longer the period. And for the ancient Egyptian, the same word is used for to encircle and to control or govern. So it says that these fixed times of the planets will go longer and longer until you come near to Kolob, which is near to the throne of God. And that governs all of these planets that are of a lesser order. And the ancient Egyptians thought something similar. For them, the sun god Re was not only the head of the pantheon, but governed everything that he encircled. And so, for Abraham, describes the sun as the greater light which is to rule the day. And so it's greater than the moon, but lesser than Kolob. And so in the astronomy of the book of Abraham, Kolob encircles and thus governs everything that is under the throne of God, and thus governs the sun, who is the head of the Egyptian pantheon. And Abraham describes this critique of Egyptian religion as an implicit critique, not an explicit one. You have to work it out and realize that that's what he's saying, and they could pick up on this, but he's not actually criticizing their religion per se in so many words. And the Lord is blessing him by telling him what he needs to say. And then the book of Abraham switched between stars and spirits. Now in Egyptian, the word for star is ach, and the word for spirit is ich. And there's an Egyptian play on words that is used in the book of Abraham, and the Egyptians themselves make this play on words. So it goes from, there is one thing over another, and the moon is over the earth, and so there could be a planet or star above that. And so in the same way, there are two spirits, and one is more intelligent than the other. And so why is, well, so Abraham, or God gives Abraham a special way to teach the truth to the Egyptians so they can come to an understanding without spilling it out so that Abraham gets in trouble again. Because just because you don't have a new dynasty still doesn't mean you get to criticize the current pharaoh or his religion. Now in the church, we use the book of Abraham for the most part for what it tells us about the preexistence. And there are a lot of scriptures that tell us about the preexistence, but most of them speak about the preexistence of Jesus. And only two places in the scriptures, D&C 93:29 and Abraham 3:22 through 28, tell us about our preexistence. And so more than half of the quotations of the book of Abraham in General Conference, and a third of all of the references to the book of Abraham in materials for our Sunday classes, and all of the quotations in the book of Abraham and the missionary discussions come from this part of the scripture. This is the most important part. We wouldn't teach, and we couldn't teach the plan of salvation the way we teach it if we didn't have the book of Abraham. Without the book of Abraham, we would have no answer to the question, where do we come from? And we wouldn't know why we were here, which in the book of Abraham's words is to prove us herewith, to see if we will do all things whatsoever the Lord our God will command us. So it is important for us in the church to retain and to study the book of Abraham. Because if we let go of the book of Abraham, we would lose too much. Now, the book of Abraham corresponds to a lot of what we know about Abraham's world, and I'm out of time, so otherwise I could explain a lot more. But I just want to look at things a little bit differently. How could Joseph Smith have known this material? Okay, so Joseph Smith published the Book of Abraham in 1842. It was 1851 when Heinrich Brugsch first translated a hieratic papyrus into a European language. It was 1852 when Emmanuel du Rouget translated the first hieroglyphic inscription into a modern language. The inscriptions that tell us about the Egyptians ruling over ancient Syria in Abraham's day was first published in 2008. The first inscription mentioning Olishem was published in 1928. The Idrami autobiography was first published in 1949. The reality of human sacrifice in ancient Egypt was established in 1993. The work on covenants was was put together in 2012, and our knowledge of the Canaanite dynasties in Egypt came in 1997. So Joseph Smith published the Book of Abraham about 160 years too early. He couldn't have known about these things. And we can compare them to these things because the Book of Abraham is true. And I testify of that in the name of Jesus Christ, amen.